Hi. I'm going to start talking today about Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, which is a book I really enjoy teaching. Out of the many things I teach, I really like Heart of a Dog. Bulgakov's probably most famous for his novel Master and Margarita. You might have heard of that, but um, I like this as Soviet science fiction, very early Soviet, and it's important to think about the time period that this was written in, and that it focuses on as we begin to read it. So I'm going to start there for today. He writes this book in the 1920s, and that's significant because we've talked a lot about sort of Soviet repression over our time together. But this is a moment in Soviet history where that is not yet true. We're really talking about Bolsheviks here. So, as I've mentioned in the past, the Russian Revolution in March of 1917 is truly a people's revolution. Everybody is sick to death of this worthless czar that is getting millions of people in the country killed, and they throw him out. There is then several months of interregnum where there's kind of a government, but there's not really a government, and there's a variety of parties that are squabbling over what they'll do next. And sort of astoundingly, considering that the number one thing that everybody is just in the country, just regular people, are just so sick of, or just done with, is World War One. Which, why were they even involved in the first place? Why did that war even happen? Anyway, there is only one party, the Bolsheviks. Lenin, the leader of that party, has been exiled by the Tsar out of the country. He slowly makes his way back after the Germans actually put him on a train and are like, go, go back. But his party, the Bolsheviks, are the only people that promise they will end the war. Like, if you put us in power, the next day, the war will be over. Now, they're also the farthest left party. They're a communist party. They want to build communism. And so that, is making some people nervous. But the fact that they are the only party that promises to end the war gets the Navy on their side. And the Navy comes to St. Petersburg, and Lenin comes to St. Petersburg, and this is that, right? So the Bolsheviks come to power. There is a civil war. Besides there being a revolution, there is a civil war then between white forces and red forces. Devastates the country. The country has just come off of a devastating 4-year war in World War One. Now they have this devastating war at home. There's famine. Everything's a wreck. I mean, anybody would have faced tremendous problems. Yeah, I hear you. You cause chaos coming up here. She's here to supervise. So, here we are. Lenin dies in 1924. It's not really until 1930 that Stalin consolidates his power. Throughout the 1920s, particularly in the early part of the 1920s, there's a great deal of artistic freedom. In fact, it's an immensely interesting age It's an immensely interesting age in Russian art. Because the Tsar, as recall, was tremendously oppressive as well, right? And Lenin, although he doesn't like avant-garde art, he doesn't personally enjoy it or understand it, he's not interested in repressing it. He's, in terms of art, much more interested in just increasing the literacy of the population, trying to, open schools, get people schooling, make people literate. He's proud of his publication program that makes Russian classics available for just pennies for everybody to read and that sort of thing. But all of these people now who are free to pursue this revolutionary art, go off. And so it's actually, in terms of poetry and art, and the thing about the Bolsheviks is that it's a utopian philosophy. There is the honest belief that we will organize socialism, and then we will build communism, and there will be a bright future for everyone, right? That we will no longer have gods and masters, that we will no longer have tyrant kings and worthless aristocrats and evil bosses working us to death in factories and on farms. We will own the factories ourselves, we will own the land ourselves, we will build our own government, and eventually we won't need a government at all. Soviets are people's governing body. That's what the word Soviet is. All power to the Soviets, the people's governing bodies. At least that's what they're meant to be. That's what they start out at this time. That this is what the Bolshevik Party wants to build in Russia. And they want to start by feeding people and educating people and housing people, etc., etc. But here's the thing. This, one, is tremendously difficult to do, right? Which they run into right away. And so the actual thing that ends up happening is that Lenin institutes the new economic plan, the NEP, which is meant to actually allow for some reopening of more market-based economics to try and get the country's economy turning a little bit again after the war, etc., etc. It's not strictly speaking even socialism, let alone communism. There's also a great deal of redistribution that starts happening, as in, like, we're taking this house, we're taking this, penthouse apartment suite that you had, we're giving it to people that need homes. There's an effort to encourage people to visit public facilities, to eat together, to live together, and all of this is going towards a larger effort. So, Marx said, Chief, yeah, okay. Marx said that he thought basically the economic structure of a country would determine the kind of culture it had. We have capitalism, and so we have capitalist institutions. At the time in the Soviet Union, they had, as an economic system, frankly, a little bit of chaos, right? After all of this war. But they hit on the idea that maybe we can go in the other way. If we affect culture, perhaps it will help us change the economy. And in a way, this is sort of like hearts and minds stuff, right? We got to win hearts and minds. And there are plenty of supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, they won the war, so and they didn't do it without the majority of the country behind them. And so there becomes this very concerted effort to change people's thinking. And so here's the thing we're confronted with, in a broader, more abstract ideological sense. And this goes into a lot of things in this book we're going to talk about next week too. Human nature. How mutable is it? By which I mean, if humans basically are what they are, or at least by the time they're adults, they're sort of cemented into their habits and patterns, then a revolution is necessarily going to have a difficult time, right? Because you will, by and large, have a bunch of people my age who are set in their ways and their habits, who maybe are even genetically predisposed to their habit, right? We're kind of in a nature-nurture thing here. The question is, can we change people? Can we make them Soviets? Not just, can we make them comrades? Can we make them communists? This question of how malleable is human nature and how quickly is it malleable, right? And it becomes a matter of ideology for the Bolsheviks. That human nature, humans are tabula rasa. We're born, whatever we're socially conditioned to be, we will be, right? There's no sort of hardwired human nature that will make us behave in any one particular way. But then, besides even that, even the social conditioning that we've had over all the years we've been alive can still be changed. this becomes an article of faith for them. In a sense, it has to, right? Because if it can't be changed, how are we going to build this new country? How are we going to have, I mean, we've violently overthrown a government, but how are we going to have a revolution, right? That's really what we're confronted with. And so the idea is that through education, but also through changing people's habits and patterns, through changing literally physically how we live and how we eat and how we work, like getting people to engage in communal living, communal eating, in sort of mass democratic organizations and work, way beyond unionism, in mass democratic political organizations, things like housing committees, right? Getting people into this everyday communal decision-making kind of institutions, communal living, etc., etc. How we're going to raise kids, how we're all going to feed each other, right? By changing these things, we can change the way people think and believe. It may be so, right? I mean, there's merit to the theory that if we change our physical patterns, our habits, our ways of being, that that change will eventually affect us intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, ideologically, however, right? Fake it till you make it. We've heard that before, right? So it's not that there's no merit to this idea, but they're going to carry out this experiment on a society-wide scale, which is interesting, right? To say the least. So that's the sort of background here. And in specific, one of the things that in particular, and we've mentioned this before, the idea of the new Soviet man. And we've mentioned this in terms of the cosmonauts, right? Though, of course, they don't come along until the 50s and 60s. Prior to this, back in the 20s, though, this was still an idea. Homo Sovieticus, right? As a whole new species of human being. We, as Bolsheviks, need to make people into the new Soviet man or woman. The idea that we must find a way to take the human material that we have, as we have it, and change and condition it to become this new political and social being. And so what will this political and social being be like? Well, the new Soviet man will be educated, will be physically strong. There's an emphasis on, exercise and sports and this kind of health and well-being. Will eat healthily, won't drink too much, won't pollute the body. Will be devoted to the motherland, will be patriotic, will be ever ready to serve in the community, will be communally minded, will be moral, right? Just high moral fiber, high moral character, will be committed to the party ideologically, to spreading communism, because that is what will bring the most good to the most people, not just in Russia, but eventually to the entire world. Will be brave, will be self-sacrificing, will be ever learning, ever willing to teach, ever willing to help, ever willing to work. And like I said, will be sort of physically strong and able and looking out for their health and the health of others, and et cetera, right? You could totally get the picture of this. You could totally understand why people would pick cosmonauts as leading examples of this, right? Here's the new Soviet man. And so this becomes this project, building the new Soviet man out of the sort of human detritus that the Bolsheviks find in the wake of all of this war. And one of the main things that this book is about, Bulgakov's book, is the project of building the new Soviet man. But he puts this, science fiction, right? He puts this into literal practice. Instead of, what's actually happening, we take a dog and we try to make a man. Literally. make a human being from scratch. And so in this way, it's an allegory. This book, although it's much more than this, and we'll talk more about those things later, this book is very much about one extended allegory of this project of building the new Soviet man. We're literally going to build a man named Sharikov in this book. And therefore, all of the trials and tribulations that go into this project of turning Sharek into Sharikov, and all the considerations that go from turning Sharek into Sharikov, including the actual material, like organs, that go into making Sharek into Sharikov, all of that is part of a large extended allegory about this new Soviet man project. And so, first and foremost, as you read, I'd like you to think about that. One, the book itself just stands as a kind of snapshot for this moment. And, remember, he's allowed to publish this, so it's not, it's not for nothing, though eventually he is not Bulgakov eventually. This book eventually gets shelved. But that it's about this moment in time, the housing committee versus the doctor and the cafeteria and all the stuff that the book describes is first of all, Bulgakov's straight up depiction of what life is like under the new Bolshevik order. And we can think about that in a one-to-one way. But two, the plot of the novel is also this extended allegory about the project of building the new Soviet man, right? Sharek/Sharikov is the new Soviet man. How does it go? Right? And so we can read this allegorically too, as an opinion about that. And so part of the work of the book is sort of seeing how that allegory works in its detail. There are other things in the book, in particular, food. It's a short book and it's filled with food and eating and cooking. Even Sharek, in a sense, gets cooked in this book. And we could start thinking about that, though maybe we can put that off a bit till next week, too. There's also the issue of Promethean linguistics, language change. I'll bring that up next week, I think, in a lecture. There's the position on Soviet eugenics at the time, which was, as we said, everything's ideological. And so there's a kind of ideological position on actual eugenics, the path that the Soviets might have taken but then did not. In the 1920s, at this time, this idea of rejuvenation was literally a thing. The idea that doctors were looking for hormonal, chemical, physical, surgical ways to rejuvenate the human body. We hadn't yet come onto modern genetics yet, but the idea of breeding and things like this, right, are floating around. Things that, in the West, in Germany, go on to take extremely evil turns. Luckily in Russia, for ideological reasons, are never pursued, but there's still, at the time at which Bulgakov is writing and thinking about this doctor and his profession of rejuvenation, is very much current at the time, in terms of medical and quasi-medical ideas that were very popular. Everybody's reading about them in papers, like it was part of popular culture in the Soviet Union at the time that he's remarking on. And so maybe next week we can think a bit about that first. But to get us started with, I'd like you to read and to think in particular about, what this book is saying about this moment in time in the immediate aftermath of the Bolsheviks taking over and trying to transform society. And then additionally, working out exactly how this allegory works, who plays what part, what are the components, how do we map each of them, what means what stands for what, right? And to begin as a project, then thirdly, to just sort of start noting food in the book and eating, because there's a ton of it. And it takes us back to some themes, actually, that we introduced clear back in Module 1 when we were thinking about Wells and meat. We're going to bring up Tolstoy and his legendary vegetarianism. So that's what I'd like us to start with as context, and then I will see you on Thursday.